Hey internets. When it comes to political systems and philosophies and ideologies, anarchy is probably the most heavily and widely misunderstood concept of them all. And here's the thing, if you're one of those people who doesn't really get anarchy, it's really not your fault. Because a big part of the problem is that anarchists themselves have a very hard time agreeing on the basic tenets of anarchy, and what really constitutes a quote-unquote anarchist society, with it mostly being anarchists on the left and the right of the political spectrum having major differences. And this has unfortunately resulted in some wildly different definitions. Let's just quickly go over them. Leftists tend to define anarchy as being against hierarchies and authoritative rule, along with the justifications for said hierarchies. They envision a society where people control their own lives through mutual aid and cooperation and socialism, rejecting what they consider exploitative power structures. In other words, yes, they are what you'd call anarcho-communists. And then right-wing anarchists tend to define anarchy as the logical conclusion of the NAP or non-aggression principle and private property rights. So envision a society without aggressive coercion, and thus everybody has to enter into things voluntarily, and so free market-based mechanisms handle laws, security, and justice, etc. Also known as anarcho-capitalism. And then most normies tend to define anarchy in their heads as no leaders, no rules, no order, lol, LMAO even. So yeah, we can kind of immediately see the problem here. There's actually a ton of different concepts packed into anarchy, and a ton of philosophy and ideology behind it, and yet the general idea of it that the general public thinks about when they think of quote-unquote anarchy is a drastic oversimplification that is completely disconnected from what anarchist philosophers are actually saying. And again, it's kind of not the normies' fault, because the no rules LMAO concept of anarchy is what's largely taught to the general public through the media, as well as throughout most of the Western education system. But also, again, because many anarchists themselves have a very poor understanding of their own theory. And so, despite there being a lot of videos and a ton of books already discussing anarchy at length, the fact that the public remains largely unaware of what it really means is honestly no big surprise. Especially when you actually try to get into anarchist intellectual communities on the internet these days. Most of these discussions tend to get bogged down in needlessly complex niche theory, often devolving into discussions involving extreme pedantry and nitpicking over tiny, minute definitional differences that the average Joe could quite frankly give less sharts about. And so this video is going to try and remedy this problem from a slightly different angle, because when things really boil down to it, the only real question is, could any version of anarchy actually work? Would any of it be better than the current neoliberal status quo we currently live under in terms of economic progress, ethics, and the continued development of humanity? Or would every single system of anarchy just inevitably devolve into complete and total chaos? And so this video is going to tackle the anarchy question from this more focused angle, as well as refuting a lot of what the Breadtube anarchists have said, which should, in theory, leave you all with a much more practical understanding of anarchy, and why the discussion surrounding it tends to get kinda nutty. Which, speaking of practicality, you aren't one of those noobs that is still using the internet without a VPN in the year 2025, are you? This video is sponsored by Private Internet Access. In the digital age, everyone needs security and privacy. Even if you think you are doing nothing wrong, that will not stop bad actors from stealing your data and using it to take advantage of you. This is why having a VPN is a necessity. Whether it's from hackers, the surveillance state, or copyright trolls or whoever, Private Internet Access keeps your data safe by using no-log servers with state-of-the-art encryption so that outside observers can no longer spy on you. Their app is also extremely easy to use, and they have an excellent selection of high-speed servers to choose from, which means that in addition to being great for security, this also makes it an excellent VPN for streaming services. Whether you're using Amazon Prime, Netflix, HBO Max, Hulu, or whatever, these services have an irritating habit of superficially limiting your choices of what you can watch based on your country. And by using Private Internet Access, you can use their app to change your IP, which enables you to then watch those things that are available in different countries. Or at the very least, it's a heck of a lot less expensive than flying to them, or really any of the alternatives. Because another awesome thing about them is that Private Internet Access is an extremely affordable VPN. And if you use my personal link in the description below, you can get it for 83% off at only $2.03 per month and with 4 months free, covered with a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee. Anyways, starting from the bottom of the normie definition of anarchy, no rules LMAO, let's ask whether or not any of these systems could actually work. And it's easy to start with the silly normie definition because it's easy to just kind of hand wave it and like, oh, that would obviously never work. But this is a philosophy video, so let's take it a little bit more seriously. Could a society with no rules whatsoever, or ways to enforce those rules, really actually work? And of course, the answer is no, but let's be serious. Why is the answer no? What makes it no? Why doesn't this work? And the reason is you can pretty definitively think of at least one rule that every society needs to have some kind of function. which is thou shalt not murder. Every society needs to follow this to some degree. You need a way of enforcing thou shalt not murder. And there's pretty good proof that a society that doesn't have this rule in place and a way to enforce it is very much doomed to fail. In fact, it's so ingrained into the fabric of reality that even animal societies figure this one out. For example, wolves are known to expel or kill members of the pack who are guilty of either killing puppies or killing other members of the pack for basically no reason, because the entire point of a wolf pack is to ensure their own survival through cooperative hunting. And so if a member of the pack is just arbitrarily killing pups for basically no reason, then wolves have figured out that they need to physically remove, so to speak, the one guilty of the offense. And things like that just kind of shows how there's a sort of primal, natural, selective force in terms of social order. And moving back to human societies, we can see how this is logically kind of obvious and necessary, just looking through incentives. Would you want to be a part of society that just allows anything, such as murderers and thieves? Well, no, because a society that allows that would eventually just be overrun with murderers and thieves. TLDR, chaos obviously doesn't work. You need something in place to ensure that people aren't doing acts of obvious evil, because otherwise you have a society that just doesn't function. People don't want to be a part of it. It's doomed to eventually break down. It's doomed to eventual failure. For the same reason that even a wolf pack can recognize that a killer in their group is a net drain on their ability to thrive. So we can easily scratch that one off. So next let's move to anarcho-capitalism, or right-wing anarchy, which is by far the most misunderstood ideology of them all. And this is largely because right anarchy is somewhat of a compendium of multiple complex theories all brought together that must be simultaneously understood before one could finally understand how it actually works. With there kind of being a running joke in the Ancap community that it takes 6 months of reading a whole lot of complex theory before one can finally understand Ancapistan and understand how it can actually work. But since Ancapistan isn't really the main focus of this video, I must apologize because I am now about to commit a cardinal video essay documentary sin. I'm going to give you a simplified lie for children, because when it comes to something like this, you really need to kind of understand the easier to get wrong thing before you can really understand the correct thing. Ready? Here goes. The key thing to understand here is that if you understand how monarchy works, you kind of already understand right anarchy, often comically or affectionately referred to as Ancapistan, and why it works. There would still be rules in Ancapistan, there would still be borders in Ancapistan, there would still be permits, health inspections and whatnot, and identification in Ancapistan, there would still be cops in Ancapistan, there would still be militia in Ancapistan, there would still be legality and courts in Ancapistan, there would still be human rights in Ancapistan, and there would still be leaders and hierarchy in Ancapistan. The only thing Ancapistan really does is follow the mantra privatize everything, but under the properties of the non-aggression principle and natural law, which grants people equal rights, at least in terms of to their own property, such as your life, your house, your money, etc. And so just like any other society that currently exists today, there's a basis behind it in philosophy. And so you would still have courts adjudicating this theory in order to prevent multiple private agencies from fighting amongst each other. The reason Ancapistan does this is because since anarchy is defined by right anarchists means non-aggression, the institution of taxation is viewed as theft, and thus a government that rules through taxation is a contradiction. Because while traditional government offers things like laws, security, and courts and other things, it funds those non-voluntarily, and thus it commits the very acts of theft and coercion that it claims to be protecting its citizens from. And Ancapistan thus offers these same general services government does, but in ways that do not create this contradiction. This would ultimately result in a society made up of tens of thousands of private cities. For example, a common question people have about Ancapistan is, but who will build the roads? Which, when you understand that it isn't really quote-unquote anarchy in the colloquial sense, the answer becomes kind of obvious. A common way to explain it is to picture a shopping mall. The mall does not charge admission because it needs customers to fund its existence. The mall is privately constructed, including the escalators and walkways, and often has its own private security. These are all funded by the businesses that exist in the mall. Now, why do they pay for all this? Well, again, because it's all needed to attract customers. Well, Ancapistan is basically this, just scaled up. A private city, much in the way of a mall, would be the same thing with businesses funding the roads and infrastructure to attract patronage. And so that is how libertarian philosophy logically concludes in this kind of society functioning without the need of taxation. For much of the same reason that the mall does not randomly suddenly send private officers out to hold a gun to everybody's heads and demand that they all pay 10% of what they have in their pockets. Which may sound silly, but if you think about it for even a few seconds, you'll realize that this is unironically how the current government operates. And so all right anarchists are really saying is that you don't need this kind of non-voluntary funding in order to, well, fund the things that society needs to fund in order to work. And just like the mall often has a board of directors and a CEO, so would a private city. Right anarchists thus envision humanity as being made up of thousands of these types of societies, all connected through a form of natural law critarchy of a sort, whose existence is incentivized by people's desire for peace and security. And so, yes, the result is something that functions very similar to monarchy, but with the monarch just replaced with the CEO and the normal problems of monarchy removed. For example, the king can no longer do stupid stuff, like declaring that everyone who knows how to swim is a witch, and ordering their execution while forcing others to pay for the mass witch hunts. So monarchy version 2.0, if you will, rehashed to no longer violate the non-aggression principle and to ensure everyone has the rights under natural law so that the quote-unquote king cannot violate those rights. And this all, of course, causes the left anarchists to cry foul. Hey, wait a minute, this isn't anarchy. You still have hierarchies and capitalist exploitation. This is just neo-feudalism. But for now, let's just say that yes, right anarchy works in both theory and practice, but with the question of whether or not it's really anarchy. We'll get to that later. Let's now move on to the real meat of this video, leftist anarchy. Oh boy, here we go. So what exactly is leftist anarchy? How does it work? Well, it's actually quite simple. It's legitimately just communism. No, really, that's it. That's all it is. It's just communism. There is no meaningful difference whatsoever between anarcho-communism and communism. There's no punchline here. It's just communism. And of course, it doesn't work. I won't explain why it doesn't work in this video because I've already done so in many other videos. The point I'm making here is that the entire distinction of leftist anarchy is entirely fake. Now, of course, if you listen to any leftist anarchist or read any left anarchist theory at length, you'll notice that left anarchy, of course, have people who say that there is a lot more to it than just being communism, and they honestly talk a pretty good talk. But if you're good at recognizing emotionally charged language, you'll realize that a lot of what they're saying is just fluff. Things like, oh hey, wouldn't you like to live in a world where there's no more rulers and no more authority or to tell you what to do, and everything's free and everyone gets along and everybody has equality, and we live in a sustainable, technologically advanced, educated society where everyone's happy and has free association and can do what they want, and there's no more wars, and of course everybody gets a free magical flying unicorn. Okay, yeah, I obviously added that last part, but you get the picture. You see, the problem here is that leftist anarchists don't actually understand their own epistemology, nor have they pushed their ideology to its logical conclusions, as they don't really understand their own theory, nor do they really comprehend their own beliefs. This is why when you try to talk to leftist anarchists on places on the internet like the Anarchy subreddit, the discussion tends to just go round and round and round forever. With the only real difference between communists and anarcho-communists being that anarcho-communists think that you can skip the state socialism phase. The praxis by which they have proposed for doing so is, I'm sure I can find it somewhere here. Yeah, it doesn't exist. And so yeah, that's why I say that there isn't really a meaningful difference between and communism, other than the fact that anarcho-communists will give anarchist rhetoric. In fact, they'll often say that they believe a lot of the same things that right anarchists believe in, but the problem is they don't actually believe it. And that's actually the cheat code I'm going to show you, where you can kind of skip through reading a whole lot of leftist theory and arguing with a whole lot of leftist anarchists, which is that when they actually try to explain their own theory, and you carefully examine between the lines of what they are saying, you'll realize that they don't really consistently believe in any of the things that they claim other than communism. That's the only thing that they really consistently believe in. And on everything else, they proceed to just constantly contradict themselves, often pulling things from Ancap theory into communism, creating sort of weird hodgepodge theories that have absolutely no logical compatibility with each other whatsoever. Let's just go through a bunch of anarchist breadtubers and I'll show you what I mean, starting with hierarchy. And we'll start with an excerpt from this video from Thought Slime.
Anarchist praxis tends to revolve around taking shit from rich perverts and giving it to people who need it, fighting systems designed to prevent oppressed folk from being in control of their own lives, and violating the non-aggression principle all over a Nazi's face.
Now, this is honestly a fantastic clip, because not only is he contradicting himself here, but he's also accidentally admitting that this contradiction is at the center of anarcho-communist praxis. Because the context of this video, of course, is him just saying that anarcho-capitalism isn't really anarchy because they believe in hierarchies. But wait a minute there, he just said that it's okay to violate the NAP in order to steal from people. He just hid it under the standard rhetoric of the typical deceptive Mott and Bailey fallacy, where at first he's just talking about capitalists, but then he suddenly retreated to the Mott and pulled out it being a Nutsi. So the logical conclusion of that is what he's really saying here is that anyone who supports free trade is a Nutsi, but of course that's completely insane, explains, so he equivocates instead. In fact, that's a really standard commie grift, is that they claim to be against Newtsies, but they actually believe that anybody who isn't a commie themselves is a Newtsie. So even if you're actually a really progressive person, say you're very accepting of LGBT and other various alternative lifestyle, let's say you're a very live and let live person, but you don't believe in communism, guess what? Spoiler alert, you're also a Newtsie. At least according to this Mott and Bailey game they play. But aside from just the stereotypical dishonest rhetoric of equating everyone to the right of Obama as being a Newtsie, the real problem here comes down to a simple question. Okay, Thought Slime, how exactly are you going to violate the NAP and step all over the NAP without a hierarchy? That's kind of a conundrum there, isn't it? Because the thing is, as an actual praxis to enact an ideology or a theory, the only way that aggression can actually work as a component of that is if you consistently have more power than the people you are aggressing on, which means you'd need a hierarchy for this to actually work. So if multiple people are ganging up on someone to steal their property, guess what? That's a hierarchy. That's tyranny by majority. That is a hierarchy. And this is kind of the general first problem with anarcho-communist theory, is that they claim to be against hierarchies, but it's actually very difficult to really be against hierarchies. It's not really a consistent position you can really take. And so thus it comes as no surprise that anarcho-communists actually do believe in it. But they believe in it in a very specific context. And that of course is in sticking it to capitalism or enforcing equality. That's when they believe in hierarchy. For instance, one common anarcho-communist meme is this one right here, which is an inversion of the Gadsden flag. We will tread wherever there's inequality. And what this really just effectively shows us is that they don't really disagree with hierarchies. They believe in what they consider necessary hierarchy. What is a necessary hierarchy? Well, whatever hierarchy is needed to instill communism. And yeah, spoiler alert, that is the pattern we're gonna see in all of these. The problem with anarcho-communist theory or leftist anarchist theory just in general is that everything that they claim to believe other than communism, they only actually believe it to the degree by which they can use it to instill communism. And then they immediately drop those beliefs in scenarios where it would not instill communism. Hence why I say the only consistent thing that they really believe in is just communism. There's no actual difference. And because hierarchies are basically impossible to not believe in, this particular fumble is the rule rather than the exception. For example, in another video from Andrewism, the problem with hierarchy, where we find similar contradictions.
Hierarchy relies on the principle of authority, which is a social construct that empowers the ruler in a hierarchical relationship to give commands and make the subordinate obey under threat of violence. This coercive and controlling system is upheld by both violence and moral conditioning in order to keep subordinates passive in their position of subordination. Authority is an ongoing social relationship between people based on domination and submission, not an isolated act of force. Nor is it authoritarian to use force to prevent authorities from establishing themselves. Organized resistance to attempts by oppressors to maintain or restore their position of authority is not itself oppressive. However, if former oppressors are just replaced with new ones who claim to be the vanguard of the people's liberation, that reversal of position does nothing to actually dissolve the oppressor-oppressed dynamic.
Okay, now, this argument from Andrewism may at first seem a lot more reasonable. After all, self-defense is not the same thing as murder, which is actually why right anarchists tend to use the word aggression rather than violence, because it puts a focus on who started the conflict, and recognizing that a victim simply preventing themselves from becoming a victim obviously should not be seen as in the wrong from any kind of ethical standpoint. But the thing is, that's still at odds with the claim of being against hierarchy. And in this video, he even claimed that there's no such thing as a justified hierarchy, and yet his recognition that there's some kind of ethical property to who's in the right and who's in the wrong in any kind of conflict, it's like Andrew's so close to recognizing the truth and the flaws in his own ideology, and yet so far. Because what he's accidentally recognizing here is that there is in fact such a thing as a justified hierarchy. If someone really is morally in the right, then it is a good thing when they have more power than someone who is not. There's nothing inherently wrong with hierarchy, and he's actually recognizing that here. He just doesn't put two and two together. But of course, the bigger problem comes down when you recognize what these people consider to be quote-unquote oppressive. Because we can see in other videos that he considers capitalism to be oppressive. So in other words, in many ways, this is actually just the exact same argument that Thought Slime made. It's just better worded since he used the word oppressor instead of the usual Newtsie, Mott and Bailey fallacy. But it's obvious he really just means capitalism, and so if you support it, then that makes you an oppressor. Which then just kind of bleeds us into the next problem. The issue of not really believing that authority is bad, as shown by the inherent contradiction of opposing both capitalism and authority. And to keep things fair, I'm going to let a left anarchist define what they mean by authority. So here's a clip from Zoe Baker.
So the few definitions of authority that anarchists provide tend to be brief. So Alexander Berkman says that the right to compel you is called authority, and all government, all law, and authority finally rest on violence and force, on punishment or the fear of punishment. Lycée Reclus similarly defines authority as the right to command. Now, this definition actually follows common usage at the time. So the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, which begins publication in the 1880s, defines authority as the power or right to enforce obedience, moral or legal supremacy, a right to command or give an ultimate decision. So right to command, it's common usage. Turns out that's why they don't define it, because they're actually following the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, where things get complicated is that what exactly authority means to anarchists can best be understood by connecting these definitions with their views on freedom. So, very complicated topic, but one of the main ways that they think about freedom is that you can be made unfree if you are dominated. A person is dominated if they are subordinate to someone who wields the arbitrary power to impose their will on them. If a person is subject to the arbitrary power of another, then even if it is not currently being exercised, then they are being dominated.
Now, keep in mind, in order to really get this, you kind of have to watch the whole thing, because it also goes into what authority is not. Mainly that they don't consider authority to be the same thing as expertise, but it's mostly just waffling on about nothing, and what is said in the beginning is the gist of it. And also where we run into problems. So the right to compel people is called authority, and governments relying on violence and force in this right to command. That if you are being dominated by this force, you are not free, which goes hand in hand with their belief of being against hierarchies, although as I've explained, they aren't really against hierarchies. No, the problem here has to do with capitalism. Capitalism is really just the rights to private property combined with people's right to freely exchange goods and services. So if Farmer Joe has a farm, then capitalism says he has the right to the fruits of his farm, and he has the rights to exchange those goods on the market. But since anarcho-communists consider that to be a form of hierarchical authority, well, that's kind of a contradiction, because the basis of capitalism really just needs two consenting adults, in pretty much any kind of situation you can imagine. And this kind of comes back to an issue with just communism in general. Anything can be considered a trade currency, even if what we consider money or dollars or whatever doesn't actually exist anymore. Money, in essence, is just a trade medium. Anything can be used in its place so long as two consenting adults view it as having value. And so for communism to actually exist, there must be a rule against this kind of trade, which means there's an authority over it by their own definition. And this confusion is further emphasized by their claim that capitalism requires a state, like this clip right here.
I'm going to talk about the state's raison d'etre. Capitalism. I've talked about capitalism a lot on this channel.
Now, to understand where they're coming from and why this was wrong, you have to go a little bit into Proudhon, who's a famous 1800s author of left anarchist theory, to some degree at least. And there's two phrases that Proudhon stated that leads to a bit of a confusion, which he's claimed that both property is theft and property is freedom, with the main distinction being land acquired through conquest or exploitation being theft, with some leftist ideas like rent being theft, etc., and property being freedom when it's attained by so-called legitimate means, like improving the land through their labor. And I know I'm oversimplifying here quite a bit because Proudhon is actually quite complex, but the issue here is that there's actually a very easy resolution to what Proudhon has basically said, which is the concept of homesteading in land, which is something that anarcho-capitalists believe. In fact, I'd even argue that Proudhon, if he was alive today, would probably eventually end up being a Mises Caucus libertarian, and would agree with what right anarchists define as private property rights. Because the thing is, anarcho-communists run into a very big logical error when they try to claim that capitalism requires the state, which is that it's a pretty blatant false cause fallacy. Most governments, at least the ones in first world countries, despite their flaws, do at the very least currently serve the function of basic justice and defending people's rights. So for instance, if someone commits a heinous crime in America, such as rape, murder, or assault, the criminal justice system does in fact attempt to do its thing, and if that person is caught, they do get punished. One of those rights is of course property rights, which includes the private ownership of the means of production. Now, commies see this, and since that's something that gets their anger neurons firing, they blame it on the state, because the state is defending that private property, and so they falsely assume that this means the state is the cause of capitalism and the cause of private property. And that's completely flawed reasoning. A fairly easy way to prove, in most cases, when something is a false cause fallacy is when you can completely isolate the issue and separate the two from each other. So for instance, something a bit more obviously wrong. If someone thinks the state is responsible for the existence of drinking water simply because the state regulates it, well, that's of course very silly, because even if humanity and the governments we have created all suddenly vanished from the face of the earth, would drinking water suddenly be gone? No, of course not. In fact, without us, the other animals would probably find themselves enjoying a bit of a water surplus. Now, of course, property rights is a bit more confusing to the eternal commie because it's based in philosophy which is used to construct society. But it's still pretty easy to disconnect these concepts and proves that the link between them that communists are claiming is false cause. For instance, let's say in a post-apocalyptic world where all states have failed, Joe comes out from his bunker and decides to build his farm. Oh look, means of production. Now let's say some raiders come and try to steal the fruits of his labor, and steal his property. And let's say that Joe has engaged with some free trade with his friends, so that they would help defend his property. Is Joe and his friends counting as a state here? Well, obviously not, because all he's really doing is just engaging in self-defense. Unless you want to make the absurd argument that defending one's own property counts as statism. But just the fact that you can ask that question proves that it's more of an issue of ethics and has nothing really to do with the state. Unless, of course, you want to get really pedantic and hard on the left anarchist definition of anarchy of being against hierarchies, and pointing out that the winner between the battle of Joe and friends versus the raiders is going to be determined by the hierarchy of power between them. Well, sure, technically you can call that a state, but as I've already established, you can't really be against hierarchies. And again, left anarchists don't really believe it. And by their own admissions, which is what Andrewism said earlier, self-defense doesn't count. And in fact, you could scale this up even. For instance, let's say there was no apocalypse and government still existed, but they decided to privatize security. Is Farmer Joe paying a private security officer to prevent people from stealing the crops that he grew? Make his little farm count as the state? I mean, to even try to make that argument would require so many mental gymnastics and semantics that the original point would be lost. And here's the problem. On the flip side, communism cannot scale this way. The most simplified version of communism is back in the days of our tribal ancestors, in these small, close-knit, primitive societies where they didn't have money, and instead people would just gather around the bonfire to decide how resources would be used. First off, consensus and democracy is still a form of hierarchy. If someone in the group of the tribal days, where communism was sort of a thing, disagreed, they would still often be forced by the majority to go along with it anyway. So it still fails by left anarchists' own definition. But the real problem comes down to trying to scale this up to modern society, where everybody doesn't necessarily know everybody, and everybody can't necessarily watch everybody. Well, then trying to do communism is just a freaking logistical nightmare. So how the heck are you going to prevent people from engaging in capitalism and free trade in the undercity sewers or something? Well, the answer is, without some kind of governing body of authority forcing people to do otherwise, you really can't. And this is really the big problem with anarcho-communism just in general. If you want to remember one thing to easily see the problem with anarcho-communism is that it really is just another case of philosophical illiteracy. They claim to be anarchist and against hierarchies and against authority by simply not thinking about their own theory in cases where it would require hierarchy and authority, because that's the only viable praxis by which you could stop people from engaging in that kind of trade. And what's even weirder is the general arguments I've seen other anarcho-communists try to use to try and avoid admitting this contradiction. Just look at this meme right here. The difference between anarchism and quote-unquote anarchism. Anarchism, would you like to work for me? Then the other guy says, yes, okay. And then quote-unquote anarchism. Would you like to work for me? Yes, okay. And then the commie saying, that's not allowed. This is a typical right anarchist meme that kind of shows what I'm talking about here. The only way to stop these guys from engaging in this kind of capitalist trade for someone to interject, which means they need authority and hierarchy, thus causing left anarchist theory to kind of collapse in on itself into a puddle of self-contradiction. If you think you can dictate the agreements other people are or are not allowed to make, then you have a hierarchy, you have rule, you have authority, and so by left anarchists' own definition, they are not anarchists. They're just communists. But what's really hilarious about this meme is the anarcho-communist response to it, where they corrupted it into this meme. Would you like to work for me? For you? Why would anyone want to do that? So in other words, they're just avoiding the possible situation of how they can deal with free trade by effectively stating, but I had breakfast last morning. Yeah, anyway, for those of you not keyed in on this particular meme, there's a sort of thing around the internet where they talk about how people with low IQ are unable to understand conditional hypotheticals. So you ask someone with below average intelligence, how would you feel if you didn't have breakfast this morning? And a person with average or above average intelligence will, of course, answer, well, I'd be hungrier if I didn't have breakfast. A person with lower intelligence will say, but I had a breakfast last morning, because they can't comprehend or wrap their brain around the fact that it's a conditional hypothetical, because they lack the mental firepower needed to emulate alternative scenarios. And that's basically what we're seeing here in this counter meme. When anarcho-communists are faced with the contradiction that their own beliefs ultimately requires some kind of authority to stop people from engaging in capitalist trade, they take on the tactic of forgetting how to perceive breakfast. But we're communists, but I don't want to work. But what if someone does want to work? What if one person wants to work for another just for a simple exchange of goods? But I don't want to work. Right, but what if somebody else wanted to work? But I had breakfast last morning. So yeah, they really don't have a viable answer to this. They don't have any kind of praxis on how they can possibly be communist and also not have hierarchy or authority. Because it doesn't really matter if you consider capitalism to be quote-unquote exploitation. You still need to be pro-authority to stop it. And so the claim of being against what they consider to be exploitation goes against their claims of being against hierarchy, and goes against claims of them being against authority. However, the problem with that, as pointed out by Hans Hermann Hoppe, is that the belief in exploitation is just a confusion of time preferences. When someone agrees to sell their labor to work on somebody else's project, what they're really doing is just selling their own time in exchange for quick money, as opposed to the longer amount of time it would take them to build their own quote-unquote means of production. And so there's no such thing as surplus labor value, it's actually just the value of time. And at this point, you might be noticing that this video is kind of taking a turn of just refuting general communist points. Yes, that is the problem. That's what I mean. Anarcho-communism is just communism. They just add the spice of anarchist rhetoric, but they don't actually believe their own theory, nor do they understand it, nor do they push it to its logical conclusions. I mean, of course, they think that they believe it, but they really don't. They believe it from an emotional standpoint of how it makes them feel. From this utopian dream of a magical world where everyone gets along, everyone's equal, everyone shares everything equally, etc., etc., magical for unicorns for everyone. And when you further examine their rhetoric, this rabbit hole just keeps getting deeper and deeper. For instance, they claim to believe in freedom of association. No, really, they do. But here's the thing, if you believe in freedom of association, then that means you believe ultimately in people's right to discriminate against those that they don't want to associate with, since simply not associating with someone is in itself a form of discrimination, which contradicts their belief in equality, funnily enough, and also implies some form of capitalism, since free association is also the basis for free trade. And when you point this contradiction out to an anarcho-communists, they once again, magically stop believing in it. Or another one is mutual aid. Mutual aid is actually an anarcho-capitalist concept. It's just privatized welfare. That's one thing a lot of people don't realize, is that the right anarchists don't actually believe in having no kind of social safety net. They just believe in the social safety net being based on free association, and that's how you get mutual aid societies. The main difference between that and communism is that the aid is seen as an entitlement, which again, that implies authority and hierarchy being used to enforce that ideology. And so they don't really believe in any of that stuff, at least not consistently. And so leftist anarchism, once all the rhetoric, misdirections, equivocations, and contradictions are isolated, is effectively just a belief that mob justice is a good thing because it is necessary for the communist revolution. And that's why it's exactly how we see them behave in self-destructive, chaotic behavior in real life, and why every communist regime has ended up just becoming an authoritarian hellhole. Anarcho-communists maintain their delusion that they are somehow different than the ideologies of said hellholes by simply refusing to follow the path of their own reasoning to its logical ends. And so this just naturally brings us back to right anarchy. Is it really anarchism? Again, there's still rules in Ancapistan, there's still owners in Ancapistan, and security officers and courts in Ancapistan. It's all just private. And the answer comes down kind of to the basic definition of anarchy, one I haven't really gone over yet, which is first off the simplified definition that an and archy combined just means without rule, and then you have the definition from Oxford, mainly the one matching being the organization of society on the basis of voluntary cooperation without political institutions or hierarchical government. And then the argument against this put forth by right anarchists to be anarchists is how a ruler is defined. Here's a simple excerpt from a Mises article. The word anarchy stems from ancient Greek and means without ruler or authority. In defining anarchy, it is crucial to define the rule of a ruler. Left-wing anarchists oppose natural hierarchies, private property, and government. By their logic, a ruler is someone who owns private property, holds a managerial position, or is a government official. On the other hand, someone who forces another to share his means of production would not be considered a ruler. ruler, which is pretty much a lot of the contradictions I've just gone over. Hence, this view of anarchy is incoherent and contradictory. And so the right-wing anarchist defines a ruler as someone who uses violence or the threat of it to control others. This is sometimes referred to as the fact that the difference between a king and a CEO of a private city is that the CEO of a company serves people rather than rules over people. Whereas the king is allowed to use coercion, the only real form of rule a CEO can use is just free association. Beyond that, private cities have to be made in a way so that they actually attract people and make people want to live in them. And so acting like a tyrant doesn't work. And this does make sense. And for those of you who haven't noticed, yes, I would be considered an anarcho-capitalist based on what I believe in terms of libertarian theory. However, you might also notice that I rarely use the term anarcho-capitalist for myself. The problem here is that while we right anarchists are technically correct, in order to understand why we're correct on being anarchists, it requires the average Joe to dig through a whole lot of theory and a whole lot of semantics to finally understand. And so when the average Joe hears the word anarcho-capitalism, they think of things, oh well, what's going to stop Amazon from just taking over the world? When of course in reality in Ancapistan there would be tons of militias with tons of security contracts between the cities, and so it would actually be more difficult for Amazon to take over the world, because in the way the world currently operates, Amazon would have to really just bribe the United States Congress, since they control the world's largest military by far. Whereas in the decentralized society of thousands of private cities, all with defense contracts, Amazon would have to individually convince each one to go along with their scheme. So it actually would be harder. But the average normie doesn't hear that. The average normie hears the word anarcho-capitalism and assumes that that just means that corporations get to do whatever they want. And that's why you get so much confusion. And that's why I think it really does make sense to reevaluate whether or not anarcho-capitalists should really be calling ourselves anarcho-capitalists. Because while we're right, it is again very deeply confusing. It requires too much theory for the person to get it in their head. And that I think is why so many people reject Ancapistan. And here's the thing, the reality is, language at the end of the day, the entire point of it is just to convey meaning. And the unfortunate reality is that the leftist definition of anarchy is more closely related to the Oxford definition that is actually taught to the public. So as unfortunate as it is, it may honestly be better to come up with a different term. Something like voluntarism, or another one I've seen being liberty maximizers. Or here's one that I came up with that I've been playing with lately. Ethylanarchy. I came up with this from the Greek word ethylantikos, combining it with archy, and also from the fact that ETH is the first part of ethics. It basically means rule by voluntary association and the ethics of private property rights. Which, for those of us who understand Mises libertarian theory, it's effectively just the same thing as anarcho-capitalism. It's just a word that puts better emphasis on what it's really about, and thus is less likely to invoke confusion from the normies, aka the questions of, but who will build the roads? But who will stop Amazon from taking over us all? Because that's the kind of confusion that normies think about when they first think of the terms anarchy and capitalism put together. It also might help to win some converts from the left anarchist side who are willing to look in the mirror and come to terms with the fact that their ideology is inherently self-contradictory. And to show what I mean, I'm just going to end this on one last note and one last refutation from a video on Anderism, and how anarchy can protect us from bad people. Which, sadly, he honestly doesn't really give much of a praxis at all, other than just, oh, make society better and there'll be less bad people, and no real praxis beyond that, but also recognizing the need for self-defense. Here's a clip of it.
When I speak of inflicting consequences on bad people, I don't exclusively mean defensive force. One of the more underrated tools in our arsenal is the social boycott. In anarchy, as a consequence of free association, our society will be composed of a web of relations that can make such collective action a viable means of resistance. Even an organized minority that refuses to engage with anyone who supports a bad person has the capacity to exercise immense social pressure and thus create meaningful consequences. Bad people and their predatory strategies will remain on the fringes of anarchy for as long as we stand up for ourselves and those around us and leave no hierarchies left for them to climb. No more outsourcing our safety.
Did you see that? He's so close to realizing the truth, and yet so far. What he said is really just the basis for the concept of physical removal, which is how a voluntary society would work, and how freedom of association actually does function. He just fails to recognize that the logical conclusion of that means you have to recognize that capitalism is actually a good thing, and there must necessarily be a hierarchy of those included in the society and those excluded. I mean, simply recognizing and coming up with a definition of what is a quote-unquote bad person, again, just highlights how silly it is to be against hierarchies. anarchists. And the rebranding to a word like ethical anarchy would help highlight that ethical and voluntary nature of how the society would actually work in real libertarian theory and practice. And this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. Should we just give the word anarchy to the anarcho-communists and then immediately turn on the word anarchy and point out how just silly and childish and nonsensical it is to claim to be against hierarchies, which is just an obvious logical impossibility, as evidenced by the fact that the people who claim to believe in it don't really believe in it, or they only believe in it when it serves their interests. And that's basically where the anarchy discussion or the anarchy question is right now. And so on that note, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Subscribestar, Ko-Fi, becoming a member of the channel, or by buying some merch, or by again checking out this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Thanks again for watching. That is all. Till next time.